Okay, well, welcome to another of these Solas video casts where we interview an author about their books. And I'm really excited to be joined today by Amy Orr-Ewing. And Amy's an old friend and colleague based down there at Oxford, where among many hats she heads up, is very involved in the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics and other things. Amy, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Andy. It's great to see you. Less of the old, though. I know we're
Yes,
friends,
I realised
but...
that when I said that to go, no. Well, I'm old. I mean, Amy, you're just 20,
yeah, so
you're
am
just
I, of
21,
course.
so
yeah, right.
Well, Amy, you've written many books. Your list of publications and videos and things is as long as your arm. But there's one particular book that we're going to talk about for the next half hour or so, which is this new book, relatively new book, you've got out with a Good Book Company on the whole question of where is God in all the suffering. And, you know, it's interesting as I look at that title. I mean, you obviously wrote this before the pandemic, right? But what a book for these times. The pandemic has raised all kinds of questions about suffering in all kinds of ways, right?
Yeah. So obviously I didn't know what 2020 was going to be like when we scheduled this book to come out this year. And it has been a hard year for so many of us, whether we've got faith or not. And certainly I've found that this question as to where God could be if the world is like this, if my experience of the world is like this, how could God exist? How could he be loving? That's a profound question that people who've, maybe don't have any particular religious faith might be asking. But it's also a question that people who do have faith are facing. Where is God in my suffering? And has our sort of understanding of Christian faith really equipped us for a year like this? So the timing has been interesting and nothing to do with me, but yeah.
Now, maybe one of the things that fascinates me about the pandemic, and you talk about this a bit in the book, I've always been interested in the way that when suffering happens, it raises why questions, right? We don't, whatever our background, we don't seem to instinctively reach for, oh, well, these things just happen. People start asking why, and I've seen that question all over our culture in all kinds of places.
Yeah.
Why does suffering raise those kind of questions? Do you think, why do we have this sort of very human need to ask why this has happened and not merely accept it?
Yeah, well, I think that that impulse to ask why is a deeply human impulse. I remember when my twins were just first starting to talk as toddlers, and I recorded on one particular day over 90 times when collectively at some point they'd asked me the why question. I remember it was so frustrating and annoying. But actually it's not something that leaves us as we grow up, and I think it points to a truth about us as human beings, that we are more than machines. We're more than just the sum of the matter that makes up our bodies. We do have this impetus to reflect and to question and to ask why. And sadly, sometimes in religious circles, in churches, there can be this kind of desire to shut that question down, as if someone who's asking why, particularly with reference to God, that there might be a danger in asking it. It might reveal doubt or some kind of disloyalty to God. But actually, the Christian faith explains for us why we ask why, because we have something inherently transcendent about us as human beings. We're made in the image of God, but also the Bible gives us a language for asking why. The major characters in the Old Testament, woven throughout multiple books, is this question: how can this be happening? How can the world be this way? God, where the heck are you? And why do you seem to be doing nothing about the suffering we're experiencing? So I think the why question points us towards God, and I think the Christian faith actually encourages rather than discourages us from asking why.
One of the things I was very struck by as I read "Where Is God" and all the suffering. It's a fascinating book in so many ways, because you can approach suffering in a very intellectual way, you can approach it in a very sort of personal way, and you managed to combine the two. You open the book with that story of your friend Brenda kind of dying in her 30s. Why was it important to you to bring that kind of personal component, those kind of stories in? Because you're a philosopher, you're trained, you can argue in a very erudite way, but you also brought it very personally as well. Was there a reason you felt there was a need to do that?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I mean, I think there are amazing books out there that explore predominantly the philosophical question, the dilemma. If God is good, how can the world be as it is? That seems to point away from a good or powerful being existing. And I think, as you say, there are a lot of really well written kind of memoirs that explore the personal experience of suffering. But what I wanted to do was to try and marry those together, because I think as human beings, the way we experience suffering is that our minds experience it, our minds question and need robust answers. But we never experience suffering, well, very rarely will someone go through life and not experience suffering at a more personal level, or at least within their sphere of experience and influence. And so it was quite intentional to try and marry those two things together, because that's who we are as human beings. We're not just a mind, in an ivory tower, and we're also not just, one particular set of experiences. And actually, the Christian faith speaks to us as we really are on both levels. I also wanted to kind of approach the question of suffering not as just one blob. Look, here's this sort of thing where bad things happen, and there's not that much definition to the different kinds of bad things that happen, and then you sort of apply your worldview's answers to the blob. I wanted to really explore the sort of profound experiences of suffering that we might go through from a woman's perspective, someone who's experienced domestic violence or sexual violence.
Mm.
That is a different experience of suffering from someone who's lost a parent to cancer or old age. That there's a loss there, there's a grief there, but those two things are very different experiences of suffering. And that's going to be different from being caught up in a pandemic or a tsunami or an earthquake, a kind of natural event. And that's also different from what you might describe as systemic injustice, suffering that is a result of multi-generational injustice. And so to kind of, I guess, give our different experiences of suffering the dignity of exploring them more specifically, in a more granular way, and asking, do the philosophical answers that are out there, and actually the kinds of things the Bible says as well, do they really apply, not just to the blob, this generality of suffering, but actually when someone I love has died, when a child has died, or when I'm going through chronic illness that doesn't seem to have an end, where is God in the specific experience of suffering like that? So that's what the book's really trying to do.
I think that really comes through really well in the book. I think, as you say, I love the way you sort of blended those two approaches that sometimes get apart. We talked about the why question, Amy. I think the other question as well that suffering raises is the kind of meaning question. When chaos comes, like a pandemic, it shakes the foundations, and people are, begin to lose their bearings in terms of meaning and purpose. And I'm very struck by that quote that you dug out in the book from Stanley Kubrick. And I'll just read it for folks. Stanley Kubrick, the film director, said, "For those of us who manage somehow to cope with our mortality, the very meaninglessness of life forces man to create his own meaning. The most terrifying thing about the universe is not that it is hostile, but that it is indifferent. However vast the darkness, we have to supply our own light." I remember reading that thinking, gosh, I'm not sure it's possible to create our own light. Am I being unfair on atheism, or is this something that Christianity can bring uniquely, that even when there is darkness, that there's something we have in the gospel that can come and shed some light in it? Am I being sort of unfair on our secular friends here?
Well, I loved that quote because I felt there was a sort of very powerful honesty to the depth of the darkness of facing a world in which there is no ultimate light, there's no rescue from outside. And of course that's a possibility, that is the world that is, and that's all there is. And our secular or atheist friends will make strong arguments for that case, and will present those arguments. So I wouldn't want to diminish the the potential of that position, but I think there's a stronger argument and a stronger case to be made for the God who is there, who does exist, who is light, and who has actually revealed himself, both in history, in Jesus, in this creation, but also that his fingerprints are on us. And so one of the things that I draw out in the book quite a lot is this theme of the image of God, the sacredness of life, and that actually, whether we believe in God or not, there are all sorts of evidences within us, within our intuitions, within our senses about how reality is meant to be and how it is meant not to be, that are echoes of those creators' fingerprints on our lives. So I think that's true both in what you brought out, our need for and our desire to seek meaning and purpose and to make sense of things at all, that there's a kind of coherence to reality at all, that points towards God. But one of the other things that I sort of reflect on in the book is that actually our desire for justice and our sense of outrage when we see extreme suffering in the world, including the suffering of people that we have no evolutionary predisposition to desire or need their survival or even their flourishing, but actually we still feel outrage when we see terrible things happening to them. We might think of the Yazidi women and their extreme experience of sexual violence, or we might think in, here in the UK of the people who died in the Grenfell Tower fire. We feel outrage when we hear that story because precious lives have been lost. And so one of the questions I ask in the book is, what makes sense of those feelings and instincts of outrage about evil? And actually, the Christian story that human life is precious and inherently sacred because we're made in the image of God points towards God when we experience feelings of rage in the face of injustice, rather than pointing away from his existence.
Yeah, it's interesting because the other thing I think you said in the book that I found quite intriguing, at one point you say that, of course, the problem of suffering doesn't disappear when we remove God. I sometimes feel for some of our atheist friends, they sort of feel, well, everything's easier if you throw God out because then there isn't this tension. Can you unpack that idea a little bit? What you meant by that? That if we throw God out, that doesn't remove the problem of suffering in the first place.
Yeah. So if we sort of come at things from a materialist worldview and we view the world as purely, the biochemistry, the stuff of the matter of our lives, and therefore our explanations of experiences of suffering are shaped by that worldview, it doesn't actually deal with the sting of suffering. So, my friend who was attacked and abused by an ex-partner, who was beaten to within an inch of her life and then sexually assaulted, I can talk to her the day after that has happened, and I can see the bruises and the swelling. I can see the broken bones. I can see where her flesh has been torn and where, the medics have begun to try and do something about the suffering she's experienced. But her experience of that assault is much more profound than material. You see, it's not just the fact that her flesh has been torn or her bones have been broken, or that, she's got bruises or nearly lost one of her eyes. The reality is that her very dignity, her sense of who she is as a person has been violated in a profound way. Now, we can try and remove God from the equation, but that doesn't remove the pain of a person created in the image of God, whose life is more than the stuff, just the physical matter of their body, being violated in that way. So I just don't think it helps that much, either in terms of its explanatory power or in terms of actually really dealing with the heart of the experience of someone who's suffering.
So God makes a difference. You've made a profound case for that, Amy. But somebody might say, well, there's different conceptions of God. There's the Muslim God, the various Hindu gods, and so forth. Does it make any difference which God we're talking about here, or has Christianity got something unique to say about pain and suffering?
Yeah, I think particularly with regard to suffering, actually, the Christian faith is really distinctive in in what is being presented, because you could, if we were to take sort of Hinduism, or more broadly a kind of Eastern way of looking at the world, the predominant idea is the idea of karma, which I'm sure most people watching this will be familiar with. It's a sort of law of cause and effect that says you get what you deserve. So if you look at the world through the lens of karma, and you may not have done something in this life to deserve a particular outcome, perhaps it was in a previous incarnation, so reincarnation comes into it too. But if you look at the world through the lens of karma, when you see someone suffering, they've died in a fire, they've lost a child, they've lost a parent, they've got a chronic illness, their mother contracted COVID and they weren't able to say goodbye to her. They got 20 minutes on the phone because they didn't want the disease to spread. When you hear any of those stories, you look at it through the lens of karma, and the reason a person is suffering is because they deserve it. That's one way of looking at the world, through the lens of karma. Or you could look at the world through the lens of Islam, which talks about God being ultimate, God being great, but actually there's only one will in the universe, and that is God's will. That's why that word inshallah, God willing, is so powerful. So everything that happens is very directly a result of God's will. It's a sort of ultimate fatalism in a way. And so you look at the world through that lens, and someone is suffering, and you can draw a direct line between what they're experiencing and God causing it. But actually, the Christian faith says something really different to both of those views. The Christian faith tells us that a good and loving God created a world within which love and goodness and reason and choice are possible. And actually, without choice and reason, love isn't possible. Love can't be compelled or forced on us. We all know that to be the case deep down, but God makes a world in which love is possible, and that's a world in which human beings have the capacity to make decisions, to choose to love or to withhold love, to make moral decisions themselves. And so as a result of our exercise of our moral choice capacity, what the Bible calls sin, but also suffering, have come into this world. And in the Christian faith, we're not just left there with that sort of explanation. That's how this world can be as it is, because love is possible. God actually enters the suffering world and willingly suffers with us and for us in Jesus. So God doesn't remove himself from suffering, and he doesn't impose some kind of blind law of cause and effect. He actually enters suffering himself in the person of Jesus. I think that is really unique and really powerful. And there's all sorts of personal impact of that, of relationship with a God who has suffered, and who promises his presence with us if we're followers of his in the midst of a suffering world, and also who puts into our hearts a sort of desire for his cause, his goodness, his kingdom, as it's called in the New Testament, here on earth. So a sort of impetus to relieve the suffering of others as well.
As you were talking there, Amy, I love that quote in the book you include from Dorothy L. Sayers. I know a woman who's dear to your heart, 'cause I think that was your PhD in her work, where she said, talked about God being willing to take his own medicine. He created a world. These things might play out, but he doesn't sit up there in heaven just looking down at this world of tears, but actually steps into it, right? And that's the key idea at the heart of the Christian faith, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I kind of end the book on looking at a chapter that is one of the descriptions of Jesus. One of his titles as God is the suffering servant. That is at the heart of the Christian faith. God humbling himself to serve us and to suffer for us.
I've got sort of two kind of sort of final questions, both of which are quite big ones, so they may open up a couple of subsidiary questions, but let's have a go. I'd love to sort of see how then some of this applies, as it were, when the rubber hits the road. So earlier you mentioned the Grenfell Tower tragedy, and you talk about that in the book, and it's a fascinating chapter because you talk about the sort of anger that produced, the grief that came out of that. And as I read that material, I found myself wondering, have we as a society perhaps almost forgotten how to handle some of those emotions? Somebody I was interviewing Tom Wright for this video series, and he had this line where he said, as a society, I think we've forgotten how to do lament well.
Mm.
And I thought, and that echoed in my ears as I read that chapter. Does the Christian faith offer us resources for when we're actually faced with, anger, grief, those kind of emotions? One thing to think about, well, this is what God has done or what the Bible says, but then as we live through that, what Christianity might bring to that question.
Yeah, I mean, I was really I tell the story in the book of being there on the Sunday after the fire, and we had a big sort of public service that we were part of, and a psalm was read out, Psalm 145, which talks about how God is close to the brokenhearted, and it's just someone from the community reading this psalm to a community in grief. And then one of the verses says, "And the wicked he will cast to the ground," at which point, there's over 1,000 people there, most of whom are not regular Bible readers or churchgoers. People start to clap and to cheer in the street. The idea that the wicked would be cast to the ground, the idea that there's moral accountability, that a God who actually judges evil exists. And it knocked the breath out of me to see the power of that truth, that actually there is a God who judges, sort of revealed in that kind of context of suffering and reflected on. And as you say, and as Tom rightly focuses on, elsewhere right through the Old Testament, we're kind of given a language for lament, for walking through the experiences of disappointment and death and grief and violence and loss. It's all there in the scriptures, and people who experience those things speak to God very directly, and God kind of encourages that since it's in the Bible. So you have a prophet like Habakkuk saying, how long are you going to keep looking at this and basically do nothing, God? That's the beginning of his prayer. And you see equally sort of strong words from the psalmists. And so to have a language for what we're experiencing that is deeply human, but that is rooted in scripture, that there's this sort of transcendent source for these words that are then shared in community, is something very, very powerful about that. But sadly, so often in our sort of church circles or in faith communities, the feeling can be the opposite. We're not allowed to say how we really feel. We're told, oh, you've got to just have a bit more faith, or somehow it's on you when you suffer. But that's not the heart of the scriptures at all.
That's really helpful, Amy. Thank you. Final question in a similar kind of vein. Really, right at the top of the interview, you have that lovely illustration of the blob. We can talk about this topic as a bit of sort of blob, self-contained and separated off from everything else, and we can do that very easily when we talk about grief and pain and loss from the outside. But I wondered about, what about when you're going through grief and pain and loss from the inside, when you're the person who is doing perhaps the dying? When someone we care about dies, we're watching that from the outside, but when you're the one who's doing the dying, I was very struck by, you told the story in the book of the story of Nabil Qureshi, very dear friend of mine and of yours, who died in his early 30s from cancer. And I was incredibly struck, as many of us were, by how he died, the process, the faith that he had, the joy that came out of him, even when his body was failing. And I suppose my last question, again, very sort of practical, perhaps pastoral one, what does the Christian faith have to say to somebody who is going through that process, whether it's, striking them young, like Nabil, maybe there's someone who's watching this who's, wrestling with COVID in their 80s or something. What does the Christian faith have to say about how we die well, I guess, and face these things?
Wow. Yeah, it's wonderful to remember Nabil, and I agree that he led brilliantly in that era of his life, as in other eras. I think the place that I would want to go to is the words of Jesus, and I do talk about these in the book in John 14. And a number of dying people I've been with sort of at the end, and the sense in John's Gospel in chapter 14 where Jesus talks about going ahead and preparing a place for us. He says, my Father's house, there are many rooms. I'm going ahead to prepare a place. So there's this expansive vision of a home after death, a place for you, a place where you are known and named and welcomed. And Jesus has prepared that place for you. And then this amazing phrase, he says, and I will come back and take you to be with me where I am. So the promise for a follower of Jesus is not just a secure destination, a sort of home in heaven after we die, but that even the very process of death, that moment of the last breath, that moment where we just don't know, we can't imagine what it's going to feel like, what happens to our consciousness as we die. The promise of the Bible is that Jesus accompanies us, that he's with us, that he will come and take us to be with him. And so the hope of the Christian in death, I think, is about destination. It is about there being a place for us and an ongoing eternal home. But more than that, it's about the person of Jesus. It's this promise that we're not alone, even in that most frightening moment of being alone, one's own death, but that Jesus is with us in that moment. And that's an offer that is available to anyone who will turn to Jesus and follow him.
That's a wonderful place to end it. Amy, thank you for taking the time to talk about the book. It's been a pleasure as ever. So we've been talking about Where is God in All the Sufferings, published by the Good Book Company. And as we said at the top of the show, we have 6 copies of that to give away. So if you read the show notes beneath this on Facebook or YouTube, wherever you're watching this, find out how to enter that competition to win one of those books of Amy's. But Amy, thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much, Andy. Thank you.